She never saw herself as extraordinary. To her neighbors, she was just a quiet woman living an ordinary life, someone who kept to herself. Someone who blended into the background. But behind closed doors, she carried a dream that wouldn't let her go. Each night, after the day's chores were done, she sat at her small wooden desk with a pen in her hand and poured her heart onto the pages. Writing wasn't just a hobby for her, was an escape. A way to give life to the stories she'd carried inside for years, when she finally gathered the courage to share her work. The response was not what she expected. Friends politely smiled. Some critics outright laughed, and one publisher told her flat out that her book was trash. For most people, those words might have been enough to put the pen down forever. And for a moment, she wondered if they were right. Was her dream nothing more than a foolish attempt? But something inside her refused to give up. With no connections, no fancy degree, and no one cheering her on, she pressed forward anyway. She believed that if just one reader could connect with her words, then it would all be worth it. Slowly, piece by piece, she managed to put her book out into the world. At first, sales trickled in, a handful of readers here and there. She watched quietly as reviews started to appear, and to her surprise, strangers were writing about how her story touched them, how it felt real, how it gave them hope. And then, something incredible began to happen. The same book that had once been called worthless started spreading like wildfire. Word of mouth carried it farther than she ever imagined, reaching places and people she had never dreamed of. Orders poured in, and soon, that simple woman found herself holding the title of a best-selling author, her book selling not just hundreds, not just thousands, but over 1 million copies. But success came with its own twist, and not everyone was happy to see her rise. She never expected that success would attract as much doubt as failure once had. At first, people from her own town, the same ones who once dismissed her dream, now began to whisper in hushed tones. Some said she had been lucky. Others claimed there must have been someone powerful backing her. They couldn't believe that. A woman with no connections, no big city agent, and no wealthy background could possibly write a book that captured so many hearts. And while strangers across the world celebrated her words, those closest to her looked at her with suspicion. The truth was far simpler and far more complicated. She had lived a quiet life, but that life had been full of moments most people never knew. The struggles of raising herself through hardship, the silence of being ignored, the countless times she felt invisible, all of that had shaped the story she wrote. Her characters weren't polished heroes or untouchable icons. They were ordinary people, broken but searching for light, much like she had been. Readers felt that, even if they didn't know her name. They saw pieces of themselves in her words, and that connection was something no critic or publisher could have predicted. But success brought a different kind of loneliness. The woman who once wrote at her kitchen table now had reporters knocking on her door, questions she wasn't ready to answer, and offers she didn't know how to trust. Publishers who had once rejected her now wanted her signature on their contracts. And somewhere in the middle of it all, she began to wonder if her dream was slipping out of her hands and becoming something else entirely. Because, as her book climbed higher on bestseller lists, she realized that the story wasn't only hers anymore, and with that came a weight she never expected. The woman who once lived in silence now found herself in the middle of noise she never asked for. Her name appeared in magazines, her face was suddenly recognizable, and her phone never stopped ringing. But behind every cheerful headline, there were whispers she couldn't ignore. Some accused her of stealing the idea. Others claimed there was no way she could have written something so powerful on her own. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself that doubt always followed success. Yet deep down, a question began to grow. Why were people so determined to tear her down? Her book had been born from nights of struggle, from the years she spent alone with her thoughts and a notebook. filled with half-finished chapters. She had no mentor, no secret partner, no hidden hand guiding her. Every word came from the life she had lived, the quiet disappointments, the small victories, the resilience no one else had noticed. But as her story spread across the world, it almost felt like pieces of her private self had been stolen and laid bare for strangers to dissect. She found herself caught between pride and fear. Pride that her words meant so much to so many, and fear that the very thing she loved her writing was slipping away under the weight of other people's opinions. Friends she once trusted grew distant. Some even hinted that she had changed. That success had made her different, but she hadn't changed. If anything, the world around her had, and it wasn't always kind. Still, in the middle of the chaos, one question echoed louder than the rest. Who had started the rumors? And why did it feel like someone, somewhere, wanted to make sure her success didn't last? The more her book climbed the charts, the heavier the silence around her became. What once felt like admiration now carried a shadow. She could sense it. In the way old acquaintances avoided her eyes, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Even online, the comments began to shift. Readers still praised her words, but mixed among them were sharp accusations, claims that her story was too polished for someone like her. That a ghostwriter must have been behind it, or worse, that she had stolen another's unpublished manuscript. She tried to ignore it, but the rumors grew louder, spreading faster than she could keep up with. Reporters started asking pointed questions, not about her inspiration, but about the source of her success. Some even hinted they had evidence that her work wasn't entirely her own. Each interview left her shaken, as though a trap had been laid in every polite question. The woman who once only wanted her story to be heard now found herself defending her very name. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would sit with the original notebooks that held her first drafts. The pages were worn, smudged with ink and tear stains, proof of the long nights she had poured into her work. She knew the truth was there, yet doubt pressed against her like a weight she couldn't shake. Why did it feel like someone was deliberately pulling the strings against her? Then came the letter. It arrived without a return address, tucked in a plain envelope, as if meant to look unimportant. Inside were just a few lines, but they froze her in place. The words suggested that someone close to her past knew exactly where her story had come from, and they weren't about to let her forget it. The success that once felt like a miracle now hung by a thread, and she realized she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than she ever imagined. Her hands shook as she folded the letter back into its envelope. The message was brief, but the implication was clear. Someone knew more about her story than they should have. For days, she couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the words over and over. Who could it be? She hadn't shared her notebooks with anyone. The story was hers alone, born from nights of solitude. Yet the letter carried a confidence that unsettled her, as if the writer held proof she couldn't deny. Just when she thought the whispers couldn't grow louder, another shock came. An article appeared online, written by a so-called literary insider. It claimed her bestseller was eerily similar to a forgotten manuscript once submitted to a small press years ago. A manuscript that had never seen the light of day. The piece spread across social media like wildfire. Headlines questioned whether her million-copy success was built on borrowed words. Readers who once adored her began demanding answers. She felt trapped, torn between speaking out and staying silent. If she defended herself, would it only fuel the rumors? If she ignored them, would silence look like guilt? The publishers who now wanted her next book started to hesitate, their smiles thinner, their calls less frequent. Even the people closest to her began to look at her differently, as though wondering if the story they believed in had been a lie. But what shook her most wasn't the article, or the doubts, or the whispers. It was the memory that surfaced when she read the accusations, a memory of someone from her past. Someone who had once seen her scribbling in those old notebooks. Someone who might have had a reason to twist her story into something it wasn't. And as that memory sharpened, she realized the letter was only the beginning. The person behind it wasn't just trying to ruin her name. They were daring her to confront the past she thought she had left behind. She could no longer ignore the storm building around her. With the letter tucked in her bag and the article spreading like fire, she decided to confront the whispers head-on, gathering every notebook, every scrap of paper filled with her handwriting. She walked into a press conference arranged by her hesitant publisher. The room buzzed with tension, reporters ready to tear her apart. Cameras flashing, and questions flying before she even sat down, instead of defending herself with words alone. She placed her stack of old notebooks on the table, page after page. Bore the evidence of her struggle edits, scratched out, tear-stained corners, midnight thoughts scribbled in haste. Her voice trembled but did not break as she explained how the story had come to life, not from theft,